Welcome to Healing the Tigress, a podcast of conversations and stories on Asian American Pacific Islander maternal mental health. We are your hosts. I'm Peggy, a perinatal mental health therapist.
And I'm Jasmine, a clinical pharmacist who is perinatal mental health certified. Both of us are Taiwanese American mothers who have lived experiences of postpartum depression and anxiety. It felt like we didn't see anyone who looked like us also struggling with their mental health in new motherhood. But we would go on to learn that it wasn't just us and that there was so much more to perinatal mental health.
So we created this podcast because we know that sharing these stories can begin to break the stigma of mental health in our community, and we want to help heal the inner tigress in all AAPI parents. Let's get started. Hi all, Peggy here. Just sneaking myself into the beginning of today's episode, mainly because I was out sick during our recording and I couldn't make it. So if you notice I'm missing from this episode, that's why. But I mostly also wanted to come in here and say what a treat this episode is for today, especially for those of you who are wondering what major systemic changes can be made in the world of maternal mental health, especially AAPI maternal mental health. While we here at Healing the Tigress hope to make an impact in this space by breaking the stigma through storytelling, our next guest shows us that the next step from sharing our stories is turning them into research and policy change. I hope it inspires any of you listening to also get involved in this work too.
It's a known fact that maternal mental health research and funding is sorely lacking. And as if that were not limited enough, research and resources for Asian American Pacific Islander maternal mental health is even more deficient. We wanted to hear more about what it is being done to bridge the gap between research and policy in maternal mental health. So we were really glad to be able to talk to today's guest, who has a very impressive resume with over a decade of experience in maternal mental health and a strong academic foundation. She also has a deeply personal backstory to fuel her passion for the advocacy work that she does today. So please help me welcome Cindy Herrick, a certified peer support specialist in the state of Arizona, who is also perinatal mental health certified. Cindy serves as Senior Editorial and Research Manager at the Policy Center, where she leads the development of publications and briefs that highlight policy gaps, evidence-based recommendations, and emerging considerations in maternal mental health. She has led the maternal suicide program at the Policy Center since 2018 and is an expert in maternal suicide, screening, peer support, and researching maternal mental health disorders from a holistic perspective. Cindy is currently pursuing her PhD in nursing science and healthcare innovation, and her doctoral research focuses on maternal suicidality and mortality. We could go on talking about all the work that Cindy has done in this field, and we are so thankful for her advocacy and for her agreeing to talk to us today. Welcome, Cindy. Hello.
Thank you so much for having me today. It's an honor to be here.
We're so glad to have you. Would you please just kick us off by telling us a little bit about your cultural background and where you are in your motherhood journey right now?
Yeah, so I am Taiwanese American, born in Taiwan, Taipei. My family's still there, and immigrated here when I was 4 or 5, around that age, and grew up here. And I'm a mom to a son who is currently 13 years old, just turned 13, so teenager in the house.
That's the prime years, I hear.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we would love to let our listeners hear a little bit more about your personal story that sparked your lifelong passion for maternal mental health. Can you start with the pregnancy part? Because I know that you had mentioned there's kind of started in pregnancy. You mentioned maternal OCD, depression, anxiety during that time. Can you walk us through what started in pregnancy?
I always like to say that I always say this in my story that I was not a stranger to mental illness by the time we decided to get pregnant. So I actually came into my pregnancy maybe with a little more knowledge, maybe than somebody who has never experienced anything until their perinatal period. And I think I say that because I think it's even then I struggled. And, I use that as an example because I think it's so nuanced, that period in somebody's life, the perinatal period, There's very unique risk factors, and it's just this intersection of all these things that come together. And so I always say that. So mental illness was not new to me. I had experienced anxiety and depression in my early 20s, and I was 31 when I had my son. So I had been on Zoloft for a good 10 years by then. What I think had really impacted it is that my OB had said, well, okay, best practice 13 years ago, 14 years ago, we want you off the SSRI. And so I tapered off of it after 10 years. And I had read some stuff and I thought, I've been doing great for a while now. So, okay, let's give that a shot. So I tapered it off. And then we had some complications in the pregnancy where we thought there's something wrong with the baby. My son was born with bilateral club feet, and we were like, oh my gosh, is there other stuff going on? And so it became this really stressful pregnancy that I think people think about the great parts of pregnancy, but it's really stressful. Like, if for somebody with anxiety, it's like so many things could go wrong. Not that they will, but with all the tests and all the things and all the worries that come with it. And it just kind of spiraled from there with that and all the anxieties that came with it. I started having these really intrusive thoughts and constant anxiety. And that was common for me in the past too, where anxiety would bubble up and then it would spiral into depression and everything else that went with it. And so by about 3, 4 months pregnant, I was not in a good space. I was having constant anxiety attacks and panic attacks, was having trouble sleeping, just really up and worrying about baby, hitting up Dr. Google to see like what could go wrong, all the things that could go wrong, and these really scary, intrusive thoughts about what if baby like did this and or this happened or all that. And so by then it got bad enough where I was like, I can't deal with this, and I went back on medication at 3 months with Zoloft, and it was this balance of oh my gosh, am I harming baby? Or did I fail at this? Can I not do this without medication? And so it just kind of spiraled from there and titrated all the way up back to a higher dose than I was on Zoloft. I was at the maximum dose which I realize now that you could possibly go higher, but maximum recommended dose, which is 200 milligrams. And originally I was at 100 by the time I went into labor, and I was still just not feeling like myself and having, I think my son came a month early. And so it was just like a cascade of things that just kept on building and kept on building and kept on building. And it was a whole nother different thing, like postpartum. I didn't get better, and it just augmented and it shifted in different ways now that there was a baby. But I think up until that delivery, I was really trying to see if medication helped. I started therapy, I did a lot of things, but I think it just felt the unknown was really scary. And, with anxiety, anybody with anxiety knows that sort of not being able to control something in pregnancy is uncontrollable in a lot of ways, very triggering. So that's kind of how it started with pregnancy.
I mean, you had mentioned also OCD. Was that ever a part of the picture before pregnancy, or and was that even diagnosed, or how did that manifest?
So actually, I did not even know that perinatal OCD was a thing. And I did not make that realization or that connection actually until about 5 years ago. The Policy Center has a partnership with the International OCD Foundation. And we had some working groups, and we were talking with some experts, leading experts in the space about perinatal OCD. And as I was listening, I was heading up some of this collaboration work. I was like, that sounds a lot like me. Like that sounded like a lot of what I was going through. And at the time when I was going through it, and I did a lot of things that seemed odd to me, but I wasn't in the mind space to characterize it as anything else than like depression and anxiety. Like something was wrong. Something was wrong. I didn't know what kind of wrong, but I just knew that depression and anxiety was generally what was talked about. But it was during that I was like, oh, that sounds a lot like what I was doing. And so I was never formally diagnosed, but having the privilege of talking with such great experts, and they're like, you sound like you had some form of perinatal OCD, and it was severe enough where it really impacted my life in a lot of ways, and some of these compulsions. And looking back, I'm like, yeah, that was a normal, was it? But you just kind of, when you're in the midst of it, you're just trying to survive, right? So that was a very retrospective thing where I went back and characterized and said, oh, maybe this was OCD. Like that was a compulsion.
That's interesting you say that because you know how you mentioned you needed a higher dose of Zoloft during pregnancy. And for OCD treatment, you do need to sort of maximize the SSRI, and it seemed like that was what was happening. Yeah.
Yep. And later on, I think working with one of my mentors, Dr. Catherine Wisner, who is a reproductive psychiatrist, she and I have had conversations about SSRIs. That's why when I was saying I was up to 200, but looking back now, I wondered if I had somebody who was trained in perinatal OCD or could recognize the symptoms, if they could have resolved that by bumping it up. But what ultimately worked wasn't just the Zoloft. Like it was like a whole cocktail of stuff, and it took a really long time for me to find that cocktail that worked.
Yeah. Okay. So we're having some things happening during pregnancy, and you went back on the medication. You delivered your son. And I know you mentioned thinking, like, hopefully things are going to improve on the other side because maybe delivery or not being pregnant is the solution. I've heard some guests talk about how, yeah, I was looking for relief on the other side. But then there wasn't relief in sight after delivery. And a big part of that was because you didn't sleep for 48 hours after. And I know how bad that feels because I myself have struggled with that postpartum insomnia, not right after delivery, but a couple weeks in. That was the real kicker that I felt like wedged in the anxiety and depression even further. And you had this story about how the doctor just told you had baby blues and then gave you a Xanax and said, okay, do not disturb, go to sleep. So, can you describe a little bit more about this moment where you suddenly felt like it was a defining moment and catalyst in your life?
Yeah, again, it was a retrospective thing that, I mean, at that moment, and I'm sure so many people who are either struggling right now or who have struggled know that when you're in the moment, you're just trying to survive, right? You're trying to figure out what you did wrong or what you could do to make yourself feel better, or is it really this hard? So, I mean, I will just claim that at that moment, it wasn't like this big epiphany. I mean, I was just trying to not feel bad. And that sounds like really simplifying, but people tell you that when you have a baby, it's the most beautiful moment of your life. And, I fell in love, and that did not hit me, which I'm sure a lot of people have probably said. It wasn't instantaneous, it wasn't anything. And all of a sudden, there was another life next to me that I was fully responsible for. Not that I didn't think about this before we got there, but all that anxiety did not just wash away. It was like, okay, what do I do now? And my son was a late term preemie. He arrived at 36 and a half weeks. So we weren't quite ready. Like we were scheduled. I thought I had control over like when he would be coming and things like that. Didn't happen. I think the combination of that being so unexpected and then initially thinking after having him that I was just hyped up. And then by the day two, I was like, okay, I'm not sleeping. I can't calm down. And I don't know how it is for everybody. It's different in every hospital, but at my hospital, baby was room in with me. They did not have a nursery to take him away. And so I felt this pressure of constantly being on guard and watching him. Is he breathing? And realizing that I really didn't know a whole lot about babies. So you think you know, and then you see somebody and you're like, oh my gosh, like, is that noise normal? Is that, and so that sort of anxiety ramped up in a different way where he was there, and then I was afraid to touch him. I didn't really know. I slept with one eye open, didn't really sleep because I was watching him, and I just couldn't wind down. And I think it didn't become a defining moment until later on when after I took me about 2, 3 years to feel sort of like myself again. And when I started to, I really wanted to help other mothers because I didn't feel like I was supported or that it was easy to find help, despite having the privilege of having access to health insurance and all these things. I just felt like there weren't enough specialists. That I had a psychiatrist and then I had an OB, but it was like, okay, we're going to try this, we're going to try that. And later on, when I was starting to help to talk I came into the field actually by volunteering. There was a nonprofit that I volunteered for as a peer to talk to other moms to really support them and let them know they weren't alone. But I really thought about how long it would take for me to make change if I met with every mom that I possibly could. Even if I did this 24 hours a day, I still wouldn't be making a dent in how many people I could help. And that in itself seemed like a problem, and I was never a policy person. And I think when I thought back, the more I understood about it, it became a catalyzing moment because the more I understood about systems and policy, the more I realized that it was a problem bigger than one-on-one person. Like it was a systemic issue and it was a policy issue. And that was sort of, the catalyst moment because when I look at it now, I think back, I'm like, I'm in a hospital. I told them I had a psychiatrist. I was already under the care of a psychiatrist. I told them that I was on medication. Right. So they should have already, that would have been a trigger now for them to screen me, have some sort of mental health professional come in and talk to me. I was in a place where you go to get help and they did not receive help. It took me, it took me many, many years to sort of realize that the onus shouldn't have been on me when I was there in the hospital. It should have been on the team in that hospital and beyond that, the system that was neglecting care for moms. There's no system in place and the team doesn't have anything to be trained on and they cannot help with what they're not trained on. And so it really resonated with me when I started looking at the policy center and they were talking about addressing gaps that mothers fall through. I was like, oh, that was what happened. I was there were clinicians, but I think all they knew was like baby blues and to give me something to help me sleep. But then I was sent home, no warm handoff, no, none of this, but I didn't know any of that then. And so I really look back on that now as years later when I'm looking at how to better help others avoid the long journey to recovery that I went down. I realized that it was bigger than just one-on-one and telling somebody they're not alone. That is so important. And I'm not in any way minimizing peer support, but one person doing something in the dark takes a very, very long time rather than a systemic overhaul where you have systems in place and safety nets that support peer support providers or all the clinical people that it takes to it really takes a village on different levels to support mom, not just baby, mom, family, all the things that they need. And so that's why I kind of refer to it as a catalyst moment because that, that hindsight and then also remembering how bad I felt at that moment to be dismissed and to really question myself to the point where I was like, maybe I'm not meant to be a mom. Like, and I think about that now, and we're very open about talking about mental health in my family. And I talk to my son, and I say, I really wasn't in a good place then. Where like I can't imagine living without you now, but I was ill enough where I was like, I don't know if I'm like the person to be mom to you to do a good job, which is heartbreaking to think about for new moms. And I really don't, I wouldn't wish that on anybody who to ever feel that way, to feel like I don't got it and I don't want to try it and I cannot do it. And so I think I look upon that now as both an inspiration for really not wanting others to feel that way, and two, as to making policy relevant because it seems very abstract. And I'm one of those people that came into it thinking policy, like I don't know what that means. Like, what does that mean? And I'm still learning. Like I know, there's so many pieces of it, but realizing just in a relevant way, it is the safety net that is built to either fund or support or address change, in a broader term so that people aren't working in silos. And that really has been the mission of Policy Center and my own personal mission in different ways.
Yes, that last part about the siloing, we had a talk with a reproductive psychiatrist about how that feels like that too. It's like people aren't getting the training as a standard, as a baseline, even of how to recognize and screen. And I mean, part of the issue is also diagnosis, right? If there's no diagnosis or algorithm for it, it doesn't get categorized, it doesn't get caught. There's no way to treat it or catch it or define it, right? It's just sort of this nebulous thing. And like all this stuff you're saying about how feeling that like you weren't cut out for this, maybe this was a mistake. Like I feel like my heart's breaking because that's almost exactly how I felt. And I became a mom a couple years after you, and that's still happening. Like it's still kind of going on because there's still gaps and there's still stigma, and there's still these romanticized ideas that moms should have instinct that kick in, that you should just know how to take care of your baby, but it's not that simple. It's not always like that. I think a part of it also is this, and I mean that's why we do this work here, is that the Asian American layer too, right? The AAPI layer, that so many of us have this already preconceived notion of mental health as like a scary thing, stigma, medication, scary, right? And you had already been on Zoloft for 10 years before this. So that's like, I mean, like even someone like you who has experience coming into this, it can still blindside you. It doesn't discriminate. These mental perinatal mental health disorders don't discriminate. And I think as AAPI, we already find it pretty hard to consider taking medication. Just kind of feel like how we're raised. Try everything natural, try Eastern medication, try the herbals, right? Try acupuncture and just anything except something you put inside like a pill. So I don't know if you want to like maybe tell our listeners about what might have stood out as things that worked for you in terms of like medication. Were there any like challenges or roadblocks on the medication journey?
Yeah, so I'll say that my first bout with SSRIs in my early 20s, I was very much resistant. So just to normalize that thought, it took me about a year or so of trying different other things before I was finally was in a space where I felt like I'd lost my life to anxiety and depression. I was having panic attacks really badly, and to the point where I was almost agoraphobic because I was afraid to step out. I'd have a panic attack, and so it was bad enough where I was looking at the cost benefit of like what I'm losing by not giving this a shot. And it was sort of one of those last resort things where I was like, I don't feel like I'm improving myself in any other way, so I'll give it a shot. And for me, Zoloft was worked for me, thankfully, at that point, and I just stayed on it because I it worked really well, and I didn't really want to rock the boat, and so until we decided to conceive, so you know that story already. So the first time around, I tried everything. I ate better. I tried to exercise. I did all of this. The second time around with the perinatal stuff, I was already medicated and I didn't even have the energy to try to be natural or, anything else. It was just, please let me feel functional. Please please dig me out of this hole type of feeling. And so it was more of a survival thing, and it was more about finding the right mix of medication. And I know now, through the literature and different things that there are more ideal ways to treat people in the postpartum phase. And I had a psychiatrist that was very understanding, but did not specialize in this area. And so we really played with a lot of different medications where it was Zoloft, and then we added mood stabilizers, and then we switched around and things like that, and side effects. And it got to a point, I mean, I think it really took about, oh gosh, probably a whole year of this merry-go-round. And this is your expertise. I don't know how common it is, but I think a lot of times people throw things at you and see what sticks. If you feel better, if you don't, and if you don't, then we switch you to something else, and then so it was a whole cocktail of things that ultimately what worked for me, at least the first few years where I could get a little bit of sleep, was it was the antipsychotic with the Zoloft, and then later on I tapered down to like a mood stabilizer and with benzos as needed, and there was a whole litany of things. But really, we needed an antipsychotic at that point to add to it, which I would have never thought going into it, like what works, what doesn't. That was what worked for me. And because I couldn't sleep, my OCD had really ramped up postpartum, and I was having all these intrusive thoughts all times of day, and these thoughts that would not leave me alone. I couldn't sleep. And so I just needed to sleep. That was what I needed to do. And so the antipsychotic helped with that. And so I had that SSRI, was on that for about 3 years, and then was in a space to slowly taper off. So I think at that point I was bad enough where I was just like, give me something that works, please. It just did not have the capacity to think about anything else, and that's okay. I survived it. I got through it, and years later, when I was talking to my husband, he was like, "I wasn't so sure you were." He's like, "There were times where I wasn't sure if you were going to make it, and I just didn't know what to do." And I never realized it impacted him so much because I was in the throes of all of that. And to this day, I am still on Zoloft. I'm still on Zoloft, back to my 100 milligrams. Thought about, I've been doing great, but I think I made the pact with like, I'm going to stay on it, not mess with what's working for me, at least until my son is off and out, and then maybe I'll have the space, or maybe I won't. There's really no pressure because I feel great. It's just something that I take that makes me function and thrive. And so I will take that.
And I mean, a diabetic patient is going to take a medication for as long as they need to, right? It might be their whole life, and that's okay. That's totally okay. Yeah. And I feel like the word antipsychotic is a little scary. I also took one for sleep as well because I had such bad insomnia too. But antipsychotics are actually technically mood stabilizers too. So they're kind of like hand in hand, exchangeable. And I really do feel like sleep is so important. Like if you cannot get it, I emphasize this so much. And if you need to do what you need to do to get your sleep, that's step one. Everything else kind of falls into place after you can get that. So it's okay to do what you got to do.
A
Yeah.
policy standpoint, now I wonder, I mean, obviously, we are not in the space to give moms all the support that they need, but I wonder, from an AAPI standpoint, where my mom was like, I can't believe you guys don't do the month, right? Where we talk about doing the month and having someone. I wonder, that sleep piece where like we just had somebody helping to take care of baby, which is not feasible in any sense for most people. Would that be all the money that we put into other things of like, what about this sort of from a holistic standpoint? Like if we gave mom the support that she really needs to fully physically and mentally recover, would it look different? I don't know. I don't know. I mean, there are issues with doing the month and, sometimes with like in-laws and things like that. In this Asian American society, that was not something that was available to me where I'm at, and I'm sure to many people. But it's kind of where my mind is when you're talking about sleep, right? That's a necessity. But we think it's okay to deprive moms of sleep, like, oh, that's just how it is. And then you're supposed to bounce back and go back to work and do have an additional chore of taking care of another little human in addition to everything else you do and sleep, but if you can. So I feel like part of the problem is that attitude of like, oh yeah, okay, yeah, everybody does it. It's totally normal.
Or that you can just do it all because I feel like I was offered sort of confinement help, maybe not the overnight sleep part, but I think a part of me actually was really resistant against that. And I don't know if it's because of the sort of hyper individualized ideals we have in Western society that like I need to be independent and why should somebody else be taking care of my baby in the middle of the night. Like, I should be the one doing that. I should be the one bonding with my baby. So I think I really kind of like poo-pooed that thought and like pushed that away. When in hindsight, I'm like, maybe that would have been really helpful. Not to put all of it on me, but I feel like we've sort of strayed a little bit from our collectivist Asian ideals a little bit in a way. Well, and then speaking of the Asian American experience, I know that you've mentioned that, in the recent years, because of Asian hate crimes and things like that, it kind of brought to your attention also that there's been lacking support for the Asian maternal mental health area, right? There's this gap in research specific to mental health in Asian moms. And I think, like, since then, you've actually connected with a few researchers on AAPI maternal mental health. There's Dr. Deepika Goyal, who we were hoping to get on this podcast, but unfortunately weren't able to have her interview with you today. Can you tell us more about what the current limited research does show for AAPI maternal mental health, and why do we need to do more work around it?
Yeah, absolutely. Deepika, Dr. Goyal, she's such an amazing leader in this space. And I spoke with her beforehand. So I'm like, can I highlight some of your research? Because I think that she's really led the way in the space of Asian American maternal mental health. And so, just to summarize a little bit of her really important work, she has been in the space for over 20 something years now. I was looking at some of her work before coming on, and I mean, she's been doing this for a while and really just, I feel like a little bit yelling into the void, which I think is very consistent with sort of the invisibility of Asian Americans in a lot of spaces, but definitely in the maternal mental health space and mental health space in a lot of ways. But her research showed that, Asian American moms would show high levels of symptoms, but actually really low rates of diagnosis and treatment. And if the symptoms, a lot of times they're real, but it would come in different manifestations. They would not say mental illness or mental health. It would be somaticized, sort of like, I don't feel good, I have a headache. And they were much more likely to talk about physical factors in not feeling good rather than saying, I don't feel I feel mentally depressed or I feel mentally anxious or things like that. And also another key piece of her research is that she found that Asian moms will not seek treatment until it is a last resort. And I sort of chuckle because I know I just said that about my own experience even before I was a mom. So I totally relate to that, where they'll try everything else and then as a last resort, they'll be like, okay, fine. And everything else either didn't have the effect they wanted or just didn't work for them or things like that. But they're generally very resistant towards therapy and medication, as you mentioned, very well, due to stigma. And a lot of them perceived needing help as a personal failure, which I'm sure a lot of people in the AAPI population and space can probably relate to, even if not in the AAPI. But I think there is a special nuance within specific Asian cultures. And I cannot speak to other cultures. I know I'm Taiwanese. I know sort of the Chinese Taiwanese culture of source expectations and family honor and, fidelity to family, that type of thing. So I think those are certain cultural factors that she found. And so I think her studies and there's much more. I encourage you to look it up if you haven't. Dr. Deepika Goyal, she's done some amazing work in this space. And really quantifying things that we probably in our heart already know, but that we can't address things that you cannot measure and that you cannot study. And so her work is invaluable in sort of really quantifying the things that I think a lot of moms and people in the AAPI space feel. There's been some more work in the space. There's been a few scoping reviews. There's one in 2024 that before coming on, where they basically said where a lot of the research, the minimal amount of research that exists on AAPI, perinatal mental health, is aggregated, not disaggregated. And so that's a disadvantage because it lumps everybody into one thing and basically, says you're all the same. And I know that that's because of statistical significance, but at some point it's more, we are statistics, but we're beyond that. We're much, much more than that, and each group is different. And so I think the current state of the research is that, of course, more needs to be done. And I think there is some great research coming on that about Asians in that space and perinatal mental health that I can talk about a little bit later. I think that there is gradually more awareness about this stuff. I've done a few webinars in the past few years with HRSA about Asian American maternal mental health, and so people really becoming more comfortable talking about it. And then, I mean, it's very important because in studies that are done in Asia on the Asian population, we know that there is a high risk factor. I don't think their rates are any lower than what we see in the US. It's like 20%. I mean, it's a wide variance depending on which study, but around that 20% mark, I think is still relatively true for Asian populations, anxiety and depression. And so we know that, as you said, nobody's immune just because you're Asian. I mean, anybody can have this. And so I expect that just being Asian in the US doesn't mean that you're uniquely immune or not. I think it's just that people haven't really looked into it and the nuances of the experience of Asian American mothers, during this time of their life. So I think it's crucial for us to really look at the nuances of that and how it might differ from other minority groups. And I think it's so important to know that everybody has different risk factors and acknowledge that and discuss that.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things that when you were talking about how the somatic symptoms seem to be something that they describe more than like, my mental health is not good. And I think part of it is that we didn't grow up with the language to describe our mental health, right? Like our parents didn't know how to say it to us, so we didn't know how to say it. And so we're at this point now where I feel like we're starting to learn more how to like speak up about it in this great generation here where it's like we're trying to break cycles and parent better, but also take care of ourselves and our own mental health. Like it's a lot to take on. And I think to your point of like how we need to be able to identify it and quantify it in order to treat it. If people aren't getting diagnosed, right? Maybe that those rates are actually lower than what they are because we don't know how to speak up about it. And yeah, so I do feel that yeah, with our research, limited research, but I think like you said, we kind of already know that this is happening in the background. Like we know our own sort of stigma towards mental health, and that's why it is important because probably a lot of Asian moms are falling through the cracks, not seeking the help, not getting the treatment because they think that it's something they can just power through. I'm wondering if you can kind of share if there's any hopeful things that you see in the work you're doing right now with the Policy Center, or even if you feel like, are there any like realistic things that could happen surrounding like AAPI maternal mental health?
Yeah, I think in respect to the Policy Center, it's a more broad brushstroke in terms of federal and national policy and state policy. It's not specific to AAPI, but I think it trickles down because some of our work, like the state report cards, we really focus on measurement and being to operationalize how to measure things. Because if you can't measure it, then you don't have a starting point to know if you're improving or if you're doing worse or where you are in the whole process. And so something like our state report cards where we are able to have benchmarking state by state of how their maternal mental health systems are. So that safety net that I was talking about before, and also to use it as like a roadmap for future state policy work. So maybe in screening in this particular state, they're falling behind or access or different things. And so that states, I know that different states have come to us and work with us and go, okay, how do I improve this? And they're able to point out specific things to improve. For AAPI in general, I have been talking about it at the Policy Center in my position and also just because of my own lived experience. And so I think where we first started was just that nobody was even talking about it. And so the last couple years, we started talking about it through the national webinars and things like that. And I'm hoping this next year, as one of our policy issue briefs, that we can pull something together for that to highlight where we are, where we go from there. And I think there's definitely more interest in sort of pulling people together. And that's sort of the strength of what we do at the Policy Center, where we see everybody's strengths and have a convening to bring everybody to the table, lived experience, clinicians, researchers, policy people, and really, I think that we've been having more discussions about diversity and disparities the last 5 years, which is very much needed. Sometimes the AAPI population is included, sometimes it's not the focus, and I really hope to sort of see more of that focus on AAPI, and sort of really address that invisibility that I feel like is still there in a lot of ways.
We are lucky to have a voice like yours kind of looking out for our community. Like I feel a lot of gratitude for you saying that like this wasn't even your path to begin with, but something in your experience has sort of triggered this launching this path and you're still on it, which I'm so impressed and I admire like your
You.
strength.
And
Yeah.
I mean, I think it really does take a village where, I mean, what you guys are doing and normalizing it is such a big part of it because I think not doing things about us without us, that whole thing, I'm probably not quite quoting it right, but the whole idea of really going to the people who have the experience to get input about where to go, right? So you're not speaking for people that you think you know what's best for them when you have no idea what their lived experience feels like. And so I really feel like at the Policy Center too, most of us have lived experience. And so, you know, again, I don't want policy to be dry to people. I don't think it should be. It's unnecessarily complicated, I think, in a lot of ways. That's beyond my scope. But what I really do try is to say that I come into it with lived experience so that it contextualizes policy so that people can have a voice, which I think is really where real change comes.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and I'm going to shift just a little bit to kind of talking more about your current work and research in your doctoral work. There's this other big looming thing about maternal suicide being one of the leading causes of maternal mortality, and it's preventable. Like these are things that not even just for the AAPI population, just overall, right? Like moms, we shouldn't be losing moms to this. This is something we can try to do something about. And there was a statistic in recent literature. I believe the study was like Tab et al. In 2020. The study that came out talking about how Asian mothers are 9 times more likely to have suicidal ideations than their Caucasian counterparts. I actually did a little dig on this. When I learned about this statistic, I was like, I need to read up on this and like dig into it. I wrote like a whole newsletter about my thoughts behind the research. Like it was still limited because I mean it was one center in Illinois and it looked only at the suicidal ideations in the like first 3 days postpartum. There was no sort of distinction about what kind of Asian population exactly that you're looking at. And so, in this very immediate postpartum period, they found that the Asian population had more suicidal ideations than the white counterparts, the Black counterparts, and Hispanic counterparts. I think the people of color still had more than their white counterparts, but the Asian one stood out a lot. It was like 9 times more suicidal thoughts. So that statistic has always sort of like struck me as, oh my gosh, like we're not talking about this. Like this is highlighting this. Anything else more you can share with us since this research has come out that involves maternal suicidality or mortality?
Yeah, absolutely. I think I was very shocked in how I sort of fell into doing this mortality and maternal suicide work was, again, being in the field for a bit. I was shocked to learn that suicide is a leading cause of maternal mortality, not only in the US, but in various countries in the world, UK, Japan, Australia, different places. And where the Policy Center came into this work was at that point, the US, we didn't have a way to measure how maternal suicides, how they measured in the US. So When I first started in the maternal suicide, we had a campaign to talk about this awareness. There was no literature based in the US, nothing. There were maybe like one or two things from different data sets or individual maternal mortality review committees that it was not national. It was just different places that happened to have their own maternal mortality review committees. But most of our data came from abroad, so the UK, where they have had maternal mortality tracking systems. So as early as about 2003, there was a reproductive psychiatrist, Dr. Oates, in the UK, who wrote a piece about maternal mortality in the UK. So 2003, they were they were ahead of the curve, and they were able to say that that was a leading cause of maternal mortality in the UK. And when I first started talking about this in 2017, I was shocked. Like I was absolutely shocked. Like you think about maternal mortality, that was not the first thing that I thought about. Like, suicide, deaths from suicide. I was like, I was both appalled and just really shocked. And so I dug more into that, and that was that 9 times data from Dr. Karen Tabb and Dr. Kara Zivin was one of the things that I came across. And we had toolkits about maternal suicide in 2017, 2018 when we first started that campaign, and trying to get a fact sheet about it was just, there just wasn't much about it. And with policy shifts, we've been talking with the CDC, really pressing them to have ways to measure maternal mortality that includes mental health conditions in the US. But we did not measure mental health deaths in the US. The current measuring systems measured deaths from physical conditions, so like physical related deaths, but nothing that was SUD or mental health related. So we really didn't know because the systems did not count those as direct contributors of maternal mortality. And so they were considered accidental deaths or looped in there with accidental deaths. And so it was not factored into it. Again, how do you address something that you cannot measure? How do you study something that is not quantifiable or not being quantified? And so that's really changed over the last few years. 2018, we got funding for maternal mortality review committees, MMRCs. And so currently, 46 states have national funding for that. So we're able to compare oranges to oranges from state to state, and rather than apples and oranges, and having just spottings of MMRCs wherever people can fund it. It's a standardized data collection. And so that for us has been a huge win in terms of having that data and looking at it. And indeed, mental health conditions are the leading underlying cause of pregnancy related deaths. So deaths that pregnancy directly contributed to. And so now we know, that what we had previously suspected. So I think that that's a really huge win. Within the area of AAPI suicidality, again, there is not a whole lot of work, but I actually talked to Dr. Teresa Nguyen, who is a psychiatric nurse practitioner, and she is doing some great work right now. I got her permission to talk a little bit about her work, and she's currently doing some really great work on AAPI suicidality. I asked her, could I please highlight some of the stuff because I think this is so important. And what she's finding, she's writing up the paper, so I'm sure it'll be published here, hopefully in the next year or so, because we desperately need this out there. But she found that East Asian mothers, especially Chinese and Taiwanese, had elevated odds for suicidality. Southeast Asian mothers, especially Filipino moms during pregnancy, and Vietnamese moms at delivery showed the highest risk. These numbers, these initial findings tell us something is happening. We're not quite sure why. I think there's some hypotheses floating around, and I know that she is further expanding upon this work, but I think she is leading the way with this important work. So more to come.
Thank you so much for sharing that. I know it's not published yet, but a little glimpse into what we might be seeing more of. I just had this thought, like while you were talking, that if being Asian American is a risk factor in pregnancy, postpartum, and clinicians knew about it, maybe they would screen better, or maybe they would pay more attention because you have that risk factor already as a patient. I'm thinking of, I know as a clinician that like osteoporosis, being Asian American is a risk factor, actually. Being a woman that is Asian American is a huge risk factor for having osteoporosis. And so if we could have something like that, just to sort of look out for people with their mental health in pregnancy, that would be huge. But like you said, we need that research and data to sort of back
Yeah,
it and show it.
absolutely. And I also wonder, I think we tend to think that minorities all face the same risks, or whether it's like the same social determinants of health or similar barriers. And I'm curious, in future research to see that, because AAPI population hasn't been studied, do the risk factors look different? Obviously we know that perinatal mental health disorders don't discriminate. So like, I always talk about the model minority myth. I think where people are like, oh, because you're high achieving, you can't have this, or it's not mutually exclusive. And I think some of the data, not specifically in perinatal mental health, but in other mental health areas for AAPI, have shown that this myth has done the AAPI population a disservice, because people feel like they, again, are invisible, and that they shouldn't be feeling this way because this is how we should be. And that's really painting everybody with the same brush is not humanizing them in any way. And so it's the stereotypes, I think, just they don't do any. I mean, stereotypes are never that great. But in this case, I think people are just like, oh, okay, yeah, it's not harmful. So you're good at math or something like that. And I'm like, no, it's further than that. You're basically saying that, oh, because of that, you can't suffer from this, or you're setting up people up to fail when you're saying that you're supposed to be up here. And who are we to judge people where they are? We should meet them where they are and let them tell us, rather than go in and say, oh, I expect you to be this way, right? So
Yeah. I mean, we're not a monolith. We don't exist in a vacuum. And yeah, I'm not trying to say like, we should also put a stereotype on us for that kind of stuff. But if it's research shown that this could be something that could be prevented, like I just in general feel like a lot of this needs to be watched under a more close eye, a lot more interdisciplinarian, sort of like, working together and training in terms of like what to do, what to screen for, right? So we're not so siloed in our medical fields too. Yeah. All the stuff you guys are doing is great work. Like it's so important and valuable. What are some of the most like impactful things we can do now in the AAPI community to help improve the mental well-being of our mothers and fathers? But is there something we could do now?
I think what you guys are doing is part of it, right? Just talking about it, and having this wonderful platform to let people know, people who are within the AAPI population know that they're not alone, and that people that have similar backgrounds, or similar ethnic, racial backgrounds, may experience it in similar ways to them, because that may look different than other minority backgrounds. And so I think normalizing that discussion of this can happen to anybody, including you in the AAPI community, is so important. And talking about it wherever you can, and not just, I think, in the US, but just in the broader global Asian community. I was just in Taiwan not too long ago, and I was telling people what I did, and they were like, oh, that's really interesting. And I think overall, the support for moms, it may look different in different countries and things like that, but I think it's a unique niche in the US, just because of just so many intersections of things, sectionality of different things, culture, language, background, where you live in the US. But I think just talking about it is really, really important. And also, on a this is like a bottom up thing where we're talking about it, but from a top to bottom, really talking more about it at a policy level, so that funders are funding more research. I know the NIH is they're a big funder, and not. And I was looking up at some of the numbers for how much of their work is AAPI specific, and it's not a whole lot. And so I think there are some things there where we need to think about how we look at AAPI as a minority group, and how that fits in within the whole talk about disparities and diversity and things like that. Because I was surprised to note that when I was looking at NIH fellowship funding for minorities that Asians were not included as in the minority group. And it's because we are overrepresented in the biomedical field as a whole. So we were not categorized as underrepresented, which is true, but I think representation in the workforce is not also the same of funding research about Asian AAPI population. There's a lot of stuff to untangle there, but I think that we really have been looking at AAPI populations from that just felt dismissive to me. And I understand their reasoning, but I think that there's just more discussions to be had about, and that may come because of the aggregated numbers. If you break it down, would it look different? But those discussions need to be had. So
Feel like we're getting punished for achieving again.
right. And so what does it look like? What does disparities look like for AAPI? Does it look different? And I don't know. Like I haven't looked at that literature, and maybe that it does exist, but that discussion I think needs to continue.
Yeah. Oh, Cindy, thank you so much for sharing all of your, your personal background, your wisdom in your research and what you've learned along the way. It's really helpful, I think, for people to get this sort of perspective on what else can we do or what else is important to be done to help our AAPI community and our moms. As our closing, we usually ask our guests to sort of reflect back on some of their hardest times. Maybe it's that defining catalyst moment. But the person you are today, what would you go back and tell the version of yourself back then in that hardest time, in the spirit of healing your inner tigress? What would you say to her?
It's gonna be okay. You'll land on your feet and you'll survive. And you may not feel that way a lot, but just getting up every day is enough. And that, you'll feel like that a lot. And some days I still feel that way.
Mhm.
I think the healing, growing process is ongoing. And I think what this experience has taught me is to embrace it begrudgingly because it's going to happen whether or not. And so really just rolling with that sort of growth mentality and that growth mindset is really important.
Thank you again so much for sharing
Sure.
that and being vulnerable with us. Where can our listeners find more of you if they wanted to learn more about you, your research, your story, anything like that?
So I'm on LinkedIn, or I don't know or just find me at the Policy Center. It's just Cindy.Herrick at policycenter.nh.org. So that's my email.
Okay. We'll link what you would like us to allow other people to find you with in the show notes. And again, just wanted to express our gratitude for your time today and this wonderful conversation we had with you. Thank you.
Thank you guys for this amazing work you're doing. So needed.
We want to thank you deeply for tuning into this episode of Healing the Tigress. The more we share these stories, the more we can help our AAPI mothers and partners. If you enjoyed this episode and our mission, you can help us out in the following ways. Follow our show wherever you get your podcasts. Leave us a rating and/or a review, and share our podcast with a friend.
We also encourage you to follow us on Instagram at Healing the Tigress, where we hope to build a community of healing tigresses and give you updates on what's coming. And if you want more bonus episodes, please check out our show notes for how to subscribe to our exclusive content. Or you can also head over to our Buzzsprout page at healingthetigress.buzzsprout.com. We're not for profit. We are here to help our community, but any support you give us is so deeply appreciated. Above all, thank you from the bottom of our hearts for being here.
Healing the Tigress is produced and edited by Peggy and Jasmine.
Music for this show is remixed by Dr. Tony Huynh of Tony Mixes.
Our intro music is a cover of You and Me by Z Avi, played by our co-host Peggy.
Our outro music is a cover of Green Island Serenade, played by Jasmine's sister.
Cover art design is by Dr. Angela Chung.